Suffering is not just an intellectual question. It affects all of us, one way or another. I wonder what has been your experience. Perhaps it's illness, or perhaps it's watching someone close to you struggle with an illness. Perhaps it's grief. Maybe it's family breakdown. Maybe it's depression, or coping with stress and the anxiety of work. Maybe it's loneliness, even though we're so connected, more connected than we've ever been, but you feel isolated and lonely. Maybe it's depression or suicidal thoughts. The question of suffering and the experience of suffering affects all of us. And our story in our family is that my husband Conrad has struggled with a neurological condition that doesn't actually have a name. What do you do when science and when medicine says, I'm sorry that we don't know what this is, there's nothing that we can do for you? And we live in an age where we're told that science and technology can answer every question that we have. What do you do when medicine has nothing to say? Now, we are mostly well, but there are times when some of our greatest challenges are coping as a family of 4. There are no easy answers to this question. Why suffering? Where is God? Why does life hurt so much? But just because we don't have all the answers doesn't mean that there are no answers at all. Just because we can't say everything doesn't mean we can't say anything. And if you have ever asked why, it raises an interesting thought. To whom are you addressing the question? Because if God does not exist, there is no one to ask. The late Christopher Hitchens, and best-selling author of the book God Is Not Great, and also an atheist, was diagnosed in 2011 with terminal cancer of the esophagus. And he was asked, and he was interviewed on CNN, and was asked whether, despite his atheism, he had been tempted to ask this question, why me? And he responded like this: you can't avoid the question, however stoic you are. You can only bat it away as a silly one. Millions of people die every day. Everyone's got to go sometime. Now, this response is an incredibly bleak response, but it is consistent with his atheism. And it's bleak because Christopher Hitchens has since died. But if God does not exist, there's no point asking why, because there's no one to ask. This is just the way the world is. Accidents happen. DNA makes mistakes. And human behavior is shaped by instincts that have been refined by the evolutionary process over a long time, but there's no real reason to be upset. We need to live as best we can and fight suffering with science and technology and live well, because this is the only life we get. But the problem with this is, what do I do with the feeling of anger that I have when I see suffering in the world and when I see loved ones hurt? Where does this come from? The apologist Ravi Zacharias says, when we object to suffering, we are invoking a moral law. In other words, we are outraged and upset by suffering because there is something wrong with the world. Suffering creates an awareness that some things are right and some things are wrong in the world. In other words, good and evil come clearly into focus. Now, how do you define good and evil? There are lots of competing explanations in our world today. A popular one is that they come from within. There's an internal moral law that distinguishes right from wrong. Do what's right for you, but that's not necessarily right or true for me. But we run into problems with this view. You see, what if doing what's right for you brings harm to somebody else? I don't know if you remember the news in 2011 when some of the major cities of the UK descended into chaos. There was rioting and looting in London and Manchester and lots of other places. And a looter was interviewed on Radio 4 as to why he was doing what he was doing. And his response was he was perfectly justified in seizing the moment, every man for himself. But the interviewer then asked him, would he mind if his own home was looted by somebody else? And his response was, of course not. That would be utterly unacceptable. And this response to an individualistic ethic is common. You see, we're fine with true for you but not for me until it comes knocking on our own door. And then we start to invoke a higher moral standard and say some things are wrong for more than one person, and other things are right. The Christian faith says that moral values don't come from within us. They come from a being outside of us. Good is defined by who God is. God is someone who is good, who you can trust. He doesn't deceive. There's no darkness in him. And he is trustworthy. And therefore good is fixed and unchanging. And somehow this God who is good has imprinted some of his goodness onto the people that he has made. We are capable of good because we have some of the imprint of God onto us. Evil is also absolute and also personified as a being known as Satan, who has some influence in this world for now. You see, an atheist might say, the problem of suffering, it rules out God, because if God existed, he would surely do something about it. But a Christian would say it is the existence of God that helps us make sense of our gut feeling that some things are wrong in this world and other things are right. In other words, it is the existence of God that enables you to call evil, evil. Now, if God is so loving, then why is there so much suffering? This is a different question. It doesn't ask whether God exists. A lot of people maybe believe that some kind of God exists. This question asks, what kind of God are we talking about? What is God like? And many of our objections to God at their heart have the assumption that he is morally dubious and not worth going near with a barge pole. And at the heart of this question, the reasoning goes like this. Given the suffering in our world, if God exists, then he's either not all-powerful, he's some frail old man who would dearly love to help but sadly can't, and the events of life are spiraling out of control. Or he's not good and picks people out for punishment like some divine sniper in the sky. Or maybe it's even worse than that. He has favorites. You have a good life. You're my favorite. You have a difficult life. You're not. Or maybe it's even worse than that he's lazy and has the capacity to help but chooses not to, like some sort of delinquent superhero. A loving or powerful God would presumably create a loving world. So why didn't he? Another way of asking this question is, couldn't God have made a better world than the one that we find ourselves in? Well, I think Hollywood offers us insight into different types of possible worlds. One such world is in the Hunger Games movie series. Perhaps some of you have seen it. In this movie we see society is suppressed by the leaders in the capital, and the people are dispersed into districts, and the oppressors control the food, they control the resources. 2 people from each district are forced to participate in these Hunger Games every year, and they are in a man-made dome. Their oppressors can control the weather. They can turn on rain or sunshine with the flip of a switch. They can determine whether it is day or night. They can affect the geography and introduce a boundary and herd people around like cattle in this dome. They can introduce an obstacle that will likely see your downfall, or they can send help that will help you survive. And the only way to survive in this possible world is to kill. What is the worst thing about this society, this possible world that we see? I think it is that choice has been removed. And ultimately the people rebel and rise up. They want freedom. One of the greatest human dignities that we have is the capacity to make meaningful choices that actually mean something. When that dignity is removed, a great sense of injustice rises up. And we could name any number of humanitarian movements where the goal has been to restore human freedom and to restore that human right to be able to choose. You see, a world with false freedom or no freedom is not a better world than the one that we currently have. How does this help us answer the question, if God is so loving, then why is there so much suffering? God is love, right at the heart of his character, and has made a world with love right at the center. But free love is chosen. Genuine love has to be chosen. It can't be forced. You can't force someone's hand. You might have a marriage. You may not have love at the center of it. And God didn't want puppets. He didn't want robots. But he wanted people who were genuinely free to make meaningful choices so that love is possible. But the deal is, free choice opens the possibility of wrong choice, because you have to have an alternative. And God created a world that is good, but also with freedom to choose the wrong and the bad at the same time. And somehow the earliest humans were given an incredible freedom, but also an alternative, and they used that freedom to turn away from God and to do things their own way. And somehow that has introduced a blueprint into humanity that I don't understand it, but I see it. I see the evidence of it. I see it in my own life, thoughts and actions. I see it in family life, in our schools, in our colleges, in the news. We are people who sometimes we make the right choice, sometimes we make wrong choices. The Christian faith says that that there's a blueprint in humanity. There's a word for it. It's called sin, and sin is such a loaded word, but there's really only one with a capital S. And that is to say, I'm doing things my way. I do not need you, God, in my life. And when we live like that, we make choices that are not necessarily good for us. Now, much suffering, not all suffering, but much suffering is caused by the choices that we make. We're cruel to each other on this earth. Perhaps we can remember times when we've been on the receiving end of someone else's foolishness. And there'll be other times when we can remember when we have caused someone else's suffering by our actions or words. In other words, why is there so much suffering? Well, because there is something wrong with the world, and everybody is caught up in it. And the problem of suffering is not just out there in the news. It is in here. It is in every human heart. The problem of evil resides in every human heart. Sometimes we ask, is God punishing me? Am I being singled out for punishment with what is happening to me here? And I think we want to say, not necessarily. We suffer because we live in a world that is broken, and it is broken at every level.